The Imperial Russian Navy and their Soviet successors, despite all their shortcomings, certainly had some very interesting and odd-looking ships and/or ideas, especially when it came to their battle line, that ranged from more conventional battleships to something more out there like a design with 84 underwater torpedo tubes or hybrid battleship carriers. In this video, we're going to look at some of the strangest Russian battleship designs. We'll start with possibly one of the weirdest warship designs I've ever read about, the battle carrier, if that's an appropriate term to use. Joseph Stalin, the Secretary General of the Soviet Union, was an ambitious man who planned and had a strong desire to make the Soviet Union into a naval power, as part of his 5-year plans to modernize the Soviet economy. Granted, with the backwardness of Soviet ship construction during the late 1930s, due to less than favorable working conditions, the people who could design proper warships had either been purged or were out of the country on an extended vacation, leading to the Soviet Union looking to the outside world for assistance, first working with the Italians and then the United States of all countries. To take from Stephen McLaughlin in Russian and Soviet battleships, Soviet efforts to obtain American technical assistance up to and including the acquisition of American-built battleships began modestly enough in May 1936 when Armtag, the official Soviet trading organization in the United States, made inquiries of Carnegie Illinois Steel Corporation regarding the possibility of purchasing battleship armor. The Carnegie firm first asked the State Department whether a sale of such material to the Soviet Union could be allowed, and the State Department responded that it was perfectly fine, just that no US specifications could be used. In other words, the Soviets would have to produce their own technical specifications for Carnegie, and no US military secrets would be revealed. Following this, the Soviets set up a new organization called the Karp Export and Import Company, the sole purpose being to obtain naval material, preferably battleship or battleship equipment, and it was backed by a $200 million credit line from a New York bank. It was headed by Sam Karp, a naturalized US citizen and brother-in-law of Vyacheslav Molotov, the chairman of the People's Commissars and one of Stalin's closest associates. Over the coming years, the firm would attempt to collect information, equipment, and other materials for battleship construction in the United States, even requesting designs of USS Lexington, Colorado, and Mississippi, which were promptly rejected. The Soviets began looking to Bethlehem Steelworks for an ambitious 35,000-ton battleship, and through the wrangling of the US State Department, it didn't go anywhere. Where our story starts to get interesting is on August 24, 1937, when Karp approached the New York firm Gibbs Cox. We're taking from McLaughlin again. Although this company did not have a shipyard of its own, its 475 employees made it the largest private naval architectural firm in the world, and it was justly famous for the excellence of its designs. Upon receiving the Soviet offer, William Francis Gibbs, the company's president, checked with both the State and Navy departments to make sure that the government would approve his treatment of the Soviets. By now, Assistant Secretary of the Navy Edison was towing the line indicated by President Roosevelt, so the Navy raised no overt objection, and Gibbs was given an intimation that the government favored the deal. With that, Gibbs agreed to do some exploratory work. Something McLaughlin makes a point of is to show how strange Mr. Gibbs was, quoting Karp when he says, "Gibbs is a very peculiar man. I mean, he's like an artist. He likes his work." Gibbs had quite the extensive portfolio of designs by the 1930s and was a perfectionist with his work, apparently taking no joy or interest in any other matters. He had played an important role in US naval designs, especially regarding destroyers, but Gibbs had never been given the opportunity to design a battleship. The Soviets' vague specifications allowed Gibbs to design something truly beautiful and extraordinary. Gibbs, having never designed a battleship, he told the Soviets as such, but said he would give it the old college try and went on cracking with his work. Gibbs had little to go on with his work and requested the designs of the battleship West Virginia, but was turned down by the Navy Department. In October 1937, however, he was appointed by the Chief of Naval Operations to serve on a special battleship design board, and thanks to this membership, he had the opportunity to study the upcoming North Carolina-class ships. Still, that opportunity came well after he started his work, and it's unlikely that it influenced his Soviet battleship design to a substantial degree. By this point in the design process, which was the preliminary stage, essentially Gibbs and his workers gathering their thoughts, the Soviets came with a little more direction. They wanted a battleship no less than 35,000 tons, armed with 406mm 16-inch guns, the same for the thickness of the belt armor, and a 30-knot top speed, a reasonable request for the late 1930s. Granted, Soviet infrastructure might have some difficulty in maintaining a ship that large. Nevertheless, it was nothing insane. Where McLaughlin writes, "But the various Russian technicians were asking for features that could not be squeezed into a 35,000-ton ship. Karp explained that the gunner wanted the whole battleship to be for guns. The fire control wants all the battleship for fire control. It seems that there is a disagreement between all the specialists. Everyone wants most of what he is interested in the battleship." Gibbs, on several occasions, tried to point out to the Soviets that the combination of features they desired would lead to a large ship, using an analogy of a glass can that can only hold so much liquid. But at the same time, the tendency towards a big ship fit in neatly with Gibbs's predisposition. Before the Soviets could review the plans, the US Navy needed to go over them to make sure they didn't reveal any military secrets. Gibbs placed a $60,000 price tag on his designs, which were revealed to the Soviets in early 1938. What was it that he had designed? Well, I'll show you the sketches. It is truly beautiful, a real work of art. As an avid World of Warships player, I hope Wargaming doesn't see this video. I'll leave the table of Gibbs's variations up on the screen for 5 seconds so you can get a good look at them. But I'll leave it to McLaughlin to describe what Gibbs had created. What Gibbs had designed was a gigantic battleship/aircraft carrier, a 62,000-ton hybrid so large that the only existing dry docks that could handle it were at Southampton and Singapore. Gibbs had worked on two broadly similar variations, one with 18-inch 457mm guns, and one with 12 16-inch 406mm guns. The latter design was worked out in more detail. Admiral Leahy, the chief of naval operations, later noted that the plans were sufficiently complete to constitute what the Navy calls contract plans. That is, they were detailed enough for prospective builders to tender bids based on them and even work out a complete design down to the level of working drawings. The big hybrid had two hangars, an upper one with a clear height of 18 feet and a lower one, small plane hangar, with 12 feet clearance. There were two elevators, 40 by 50 feet. Otherwise, the aviation features were rather nebulous. There were no signs of catapults or arresting gears on the flight deck. It seems likely that Gibbs decided these aspects of design required more research and left them blank for the present. A lot is going on with the ship, so let's start with the carrier aspect. It had some odd, and what some might call unfortunate features. The flight deck was reasonably long for takeoff and landings. It was cut away fore and aft to increase the arcs of fire of the main battery guns, reducing the length realistically available for flight operations. It is also likely that the turrets immediately fore and aft of the flight deck would have caused turbulence during flight operations that might impair or even seriously hamper the ability of aircraft to take off and land. There was an island superstructure on the starboard side, which was to be balanced by a combination of fixed weights as well as the auxiliary equipment found on that side and adjustments to the liquid loads for the machinery on the ship. Speaking of which, the machinery plant was based on the US Navy practice, with a boiler working at 600 pounds per square inch and temperatures of 650 degrees Fahrenheit or 343 degrees Celsius. The machinery was laid out on the unit system, with the turbines for each shaft in a separate compartment along with two boilers, except in the case of the aftermost compartment, where the shaft's run dictated that the use of 3 smaller boilers. Double reduction gearing was to be used, and a top speed of 35 knots, pretty impressive for such a massive ship. There isn't anything to write home about the armament beyond what the tables listed, so I'll put them up on screen now. The purpose of such a powerfully armed vessel is something we should all ponder, and Gibbs thought about it to himself when he designed it, working in a strategic and tactical vacuum, where he wrote, "The problem that the Russians proposed to us was substantially that they didn't have a navy except in small craft. They were going to build a navy, so they told us, to compete with any navy, and of course, particularly with the Japanese. The problem I had was, if you're going to compete with the Japanese, what was the best way to spend your money to accomplish it? It seemed to me that the proper method was to build such an extraordinary ship that is, in one step, you had caused an extraordinary obsolescence of the Japanese fleet. Gibbs imagined the fleet surrounding his super battleship with 18 large destroyers and oil tankers to threaten maritime communications. If such a ship got loose on the ocean, it would cause the Japanese untold worry until it could be brought to action. If such a unit were loose, it would make it almost impossible for the enemy to count on any overseas commerce or convoy system until such a ship was brought to action or returned to port again. And it was this general conception that explained this ship. Straight from the mouth of the creator is an extremely interesting and enlightening piece. The design sparked interest in the United States, with Gibbs being invited to talk to President Roosevelt about the ship, as there were some in the Navy Department that took an interest in the design. Although with the Second London Naval Conference limit of 45,000 tons, it was unthinkable for the United States to build such a vessel. Now, the Soviets did eventually get to see the design after some wrangling with the State Department. They requested Gibbs to work on smaller hybrid battleships to fit within treaty limitations and possible destroyer designs. Still, with tensions starting to run high with the Soviets in late 1939 due to their assistance in the invasion of Poland, Gibbs told Carpio would have no more dealings with his firm, and thus ended the saga with the Soviet hybrid carrier battleship. I know we've discussed this previously, but if I'm going to do a bad battleship idea video, I have to include this: the Russian Torpedo Battleship. Following the Russo-Japanese War, the Imperial Russian Navy was significantly weakened, leading to some very interesting ideas to try to compensate for the lack of big gun battleships in the Russian battle line. One such idea comes from the mind of a young naval designer, one Pavel Viktorievich Yankov. Being a graduate of the Naval Engineering School at Kronstadt in 1910, he began working as a designer first at the Baltic Works and then at the naval base at what today is Tallinn. Although the torpedo had performed somewhat lacklusterly during the Russo-Japanese War, recent advancements in the 1910s gave the weapon similar ranges to what was believed at the time to be effective gun range, i.e. about 6,000 meters or 6,500 yards. Leading to some students of naval warfare to believe that the use of torpedoes in conjunction with the battle fleet could lead to success during the battle. Torpedo boats had already been in use in the Imperial Russian Navy, but Yankov was thinking bigger, better, and more innovative. Following along the lines of other naval designers in the United States or Germany, Yankov thought of the Torpedo Battleship. It's just that his was a bit more eccentric, being armed with 84 underwater torpedo tubes, and many other novel and interesting features. Before we continue, I should say that this section isn't going to be the most visually stimulating, as the design never got off of paper, so it's hard to find photos, so forgive me if I use photos of other period Russian ships. The one thing I do have is the final design, as found in Stephen McLaughlin's Russian and Soviet battleships, which I'll be sure to show for a long duration of this section. Now, to understand the design of this torpedo battleship, we need to understand what it was intended to do. Where we turn to McLaughlin as he writes, Yankov and other advocates of the torpedo battleship did not see the type as an alternative to heavily gunned battleships, rather it was meant to complement the more traditional battle fleet. The basic conception was that the torpedo battleship would break from the line some point during or immediately before the main gunnery action, close with the enemy at high speed, brush past his screening forces, and launch a massive salvo of torpedoes. These torpedoes would probably damage several enemy battleships, throwing his line into chaos, thus giving a decisive advantage to the big gun battleships that would finish the work of destruction. It was argued that the mere threat of such a torpedo attack would force the enemy into evasive maneuvering that would disrupt his line, throw off his fire control, and cause him to lose the initiative. So with that being said, Yankov, as I mentioned, started as a designer at the Baltic Works in St. Petersburg, and then was sent to the naval base at Revel, today what is the capital of Estonia, Tallinn. There, he began sketching his first ideas of his torpedo battleship, a 15,000-ton design with about 12 130mm guns and a few 47mm guns, and no fewer than 64 broadside-mounted underwater torpedo tubes. This very vague sketch appeared to show a ram-bowed warship, with a flush deck hull with a little above the upper decks, besides the conning tower well forward, and two very widely spread funnels. Some boats, masts, and other fittings were shown, but no details of the machinery was provided or the arrangement of the torpedoes. This initial sketch provided ideas for a much more detailed second sketch, which on a 22,000-ton displacement was armed with 84 underwater torpedo tubes, most likely 42 per side, and with the torpedoes either being the 450mm variant or the 533mm variant. 10 178mm guns and turrets, and 28 twin 130mm guns and casemates. With the artillery being so light, it meant that the ship could have very hefty armor, a belt of 406mm. For comparison, a contemporary battleship like the Queen Elizabeth's, as they were part of the 1913 estimates, when the torpedo battleship design was being experimented with, the Queen Elizabeth's had a main belt at their thickest point of about 356mm. The torpedo battleship would also have a 102mm deck. The reason for this thickness was because of how close the ship would have to close with the enemy forces to effectively get off its torpedoes and sow chaos in the enemy line, around 2,000 to 3,000 meters. This also meant that the ship needed to be fast, really fast. Therefore, Yankov called for the ship to have machinery for 78,000 shaft horsepower on 4 shafts and a top speed of 30 knots. Again, comparing it to Royal Navy ships, contemporary Royal Navy destroyers of the Acosta class had a top speed of 29 knots. Another interesting feature is the ship could also be a high-capacity mine layer with the ability to carry about 700 mines. Yankov submitted the design to the staff of the naval forces of the Baltic Sea sometime in December 1912. In the following February, the fleet commander, Vice Admiral Essen, sent the designs to the Naval Ministry as he felt they deserved special consideration. He wanted to give Yankov an opportunity to develop his ideas more fully. Essen's enthusiasm stemmed from the fact that he was an aggressive commander and had under his command a battle line of 4 pre-dreadnoughts and 4 dreadnoughts under construction. Not exactly a match for his most likely opponent in the German High Seas Fleet if they decided to move on the Baltic in force. With Yankov's torpedo battleships, he hoped to generate chaos in the German line and hopefully allow a substantially smaller force to eke out a victory. In June, Essen wrote the Naval General Staff saying, "As one of the auxiliary forces for the squadron, i.e. the battle line, while by no means insisting on the construction of a torpedo ship based off Lieutenant Yankov's design, I ask that the development of the design for a similar torpedo ship be undertaken by the GUK, Department of Ship Construction, immediately, so that 2 such ships can be included in the next year's shipbuilding program, replacing a division of torpedo boats." Essen's willingness to sacrifice a division of destroyers, still called torpedo boats in the Imperial Navy, showed his belief that such a torpedo battleship might survive long enough to release a devastating strike on the enemy line. Yankov's final design in 1913 was a ship with a displacement of 23,000 tons, an armament of 84 450mm underwater torpedo tubes split evenly on either side, 12 178mm guns and triple turrets along the center line of the ship, a main belt of 400mm reducing to 150mm fore and aft, longitudinal bulkheads of 50mm, transverse bulkheads of 300mm, barbettes of 125mm to 75mm, a conning tower with a maximum thickness of 450mm, and decks of up to 75mm thick depending on the area. The armor was to be Klopsteel from Germany. The machinery was to consist of 15 oil-burning Yarrow small tube boilers that gave steam to 4 Parsons turbines that drove 2 shafts, giving around 72,000 shaft horsepower and a top speed of 28 knots. Interestingly enough, the artillery section of the GUK generally supported the torpedo battleship concept, with their request being that the guns be changed to something more standard, like 152mm or 203mm guns, and some minor armor changes. However, the Naval General Staff wasn't interested at first, saying that it was impractical. Then, in November 1913, they agreed to use it in tactical games to test the type, with the results being inconclusive, as the enemy decided to decline a naval engagement, turning away as the torpedo battleships closed. Given that the Russians were at a severe numerical disadvantage, it wasn't exactly the worst account for them, giving some hope for those who were pushing the torpedo battleship concept, giving Yankov the go-ahead for the final design we just discussed. They followed up by conducting a tactical study of the prospects of the torpedo battleship and determined that it could be useful in the line of battle and a very effective addition. However, the design was ultimately rejected in 1914. Why, you might ask? Well, it goes back to the reason why Vice Admiral Essen wanted them in the first place: their severe numerical disadvantage. The General Naval Staff felt to effectively use such a vessel, Russia would need to possess a large battle fleet, something they did not have, and therefore the design should be shelved for further consideration down the line when the Baltic Fleet had more than the Ganget-class dreadnoughts, which, as we know, was something that would never happen, and the design was shelved permanently. Another thing to take into consideration is the threat underwater torpedo tubes posed to battleships, as it was a weakness in their armor scheme to allow such a thing to be present in the ship. It's one of the reasons why the American torpedo battleship idea failed, and once realizing the weakness of underwater torpedo tubes, they were removed in modernizations of those battleships throughout their careers, something that not only the Americans did, but most naval powers. Some rather odd and unique warships here. I'm already compiling a list of further Russian and Soviet warships to do. In the next installment, I think it's in order for us to talk about more Russian pre-dreadnoughts. Let me know what you thought about these warships down below, and any suggestions you might have for a future video. Thank you all so much for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe, as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great week.